All right, and welcome to another incredible discussion. I'm so excited for this one, and it's going to work in a variety of ways. But for you who are tuning in, hopefully you can share and spread this discussion as so far I have yet to see these two prolific gentlemen together to discuss the task at hand that basically is taking up all of the oxygen of pretty much everything that we are in the midst of with the context of the 2024 presidential election. And the two gentlemen that I'm going to introduce are William K. Black and David K. Johnston. Bill Black is an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a distinguished scholar in residence for financial regulation at the University of Minnesota Law School. He is a white-collar criminologist. He was the executive director of the Institute of Fraud Prevention, and he taught previously at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin and at Santa Clara University, where he was also the distinguished scholar in residence for insurance law and a visiting scholar at the McCurlough Center for Applied Ethics. He was the litigation director of the Federal Home Loan Board Bank, deputy director of the FISLIC, senior vice president and general counsel of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, and senior deputy chief counsel, Office of Thrift Supervision. He was also deputy director of the National Commission on Financial Institution of Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement. And George Akerlof called his book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One, a classic. And Paul Volcker praised its analysis of the critical role of the bank board chairman Gray's leadership in re-regulating and re-supervising the industry. Quote, Bill Black has detailed an alarming story about financial and political corruption, and the lessons are as fresh as the news every morning. One of those lessons really stakes out, that one brave man with a conscience can stand for us all. And David K. Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and four-time best-selling author known for explaining complex financial, regulatory, and tax issues in plain English. He has exposed foreign agents and spies, solved murders and other crimes, saved taxpayers more than $250 billion, according to Congress. And in 1989 was the first journalist to write about Donald Trump potentially becoming president, which is amazing, 1989. Johnson is not a lawyer, but he has lectured about law on every continent except Antarctica. And since 2009, after retired from the New York Times, has been on the faculty of Syracuse University College of Law, where for 8 years he taught business, property, and tax law of the ancient world and now teaches legal principles and theory. And as we get started, I've got to preface some of your books and maybe the entire bibliography from this standpoint, David K. Johnston, because it's such a corollary to what both you and Bill represent, going back really to the beginning of what I would call the first act of this era that's now culminating in 2024 with a guy that you've explained critically over and over and over for decades, Mr. Johnston, Donald Trump, that is obviously now the head of the Republican Party and everything that that entails. But get a load of some of these titles of your books. Temples of Chance, How America Incorporated Bought Out Murder Incorporated to Win Control of the Casino Business. What a hell of a way to start. And that was in 1992. Perfectly Legal, the covert campaign to rig our tax system to benefit the super rich and cheat everybody else. That was way back in 2003. Free Lunch, How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government's Expense and Stick You with the Bill. That was in 2007. And then The Fine Print, How Big Companies Use in Plain English to Rob You Blind. That was in 2012. And then Divided, The Perils of a Growing Inequality in 2014. And then The Making of Donald Trump in 2016. And then followed up by It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. That was in 2018. And this is an interesting callback to, of course, Bill Black, the book, The Enforcers, How Little Known Trade Reporters Exposed the Keating Five and Advanced Business Journalism. That was written in 2019. And then Social Security Works for Everyone, Protecting and Expanding the Insurance Americans Love and Count. That was 2021. And then followed by your most recent work, The Big Cheat, how Donald Trump fleeced America and enriched himself and his family. So, look, guys, if I could start with you, Bill, and just ask you just kind of an overview of this incredible reality that we're in 24, given what you and Mr. Johnston have known and seen from the front rows for literally decades. How is it possible that the same story keeps repeating itself over and over?
Basically, people can get away with unbelievably awful things that they do on a regular basis, month after month for decades, because there are just a limited number of people that ask the most basic questions. This is David's point in the one title you came up with, for example, is some pretty darn obscure reporters were the only folks that picked up when I blew the whistle on the 5 U.S. senators who became known as the Keating Five, not the big papers and such. And that continued. So 30, 40 years ago, many of these things had been identified and explained, but they had not actually become something taught in our law schools, in our business schools, in our economics programs and such. You could go and get a doctorate in economics and you would have never heard any of the things, any of the subjects that you brought up in the introduction. I've lost your voice, Patrick.
Sorry about that. Thank you. One of my favorite singers, David, was a guy by the name of Warren Zevon. And back in the 70s, he had a song called Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And the go-to line was, I need to call lawyers, guns, get lawyers, guns, and money to get me out of this. And I'm reminded that we've known so much about this underworld and these crazy things. And when I look back at your bio, I mean, starting off at the San Jose Mercury Press, the work that you guys did with investigative journalism back then was extraordinary. I mean, what comes to mind when you think that it's 2024, given what you've done for decades, that we're talking about the same issues that media writ large doesn't really know all the details to?
Well, if our great-great-grandchildren were doing this show in the distant future, they'd be about the same things. The issues that Bill and I are motivated to deal with go to the fundamental nature of the human condition. So lots of people don't want to play by the rules. They figure out how to get around the rules. The rules are often written by those who are supposed to be regulated. The Interstate Commerce Act, which was the first well-known federal regulatory act, there was a Steamboat Act before it, but the Interstate Commerce Act, the Pure Food Act, those were written basically by the industries that were being regulated. Congress puts up very little money to enforce the laws that it passes. The federal government follows, by and large, a practice in criminal law known as general deterrence. So specific deterrence is we try to catch every murderer, rapist, aggravated assault individual and pursue them. The federal government says, well, let's pick somebody who they'll get attention to our pursuit of this person, and that will deter others. We'll say, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. 15 years ago or so, I did a story pointing out that something like 95% of the Internal Revenue Service cases that became criminal prosecutions by the Justice Department got no publicity at all. So that the theory of general deterrence is absurd unless you follow through with getting a lot of news coverage. And this is just the nature of human beings. There will always be people who are essentially venal and people who are moral, people who want to do well and people who want to do harm, and a lot of people who don't care one way or the other. That's why in a democracy, we need to recognize that it isn't like we solve the problem and then it's over. It's a constant process. When I spent several years exposing the Los Angeles Police Department for the LA Times, which the paper did not want to do. Eventually, the city council passed a law to deal with police spying. The police chief had actually assigned young officers coming out of the academy to sleep with women to get information. I mean, think about it for a minute. What an easier, better way to get information about any group you want to spy on than send in some buff young cop just out of the academy, find a woman, and she'll start telling you everything. And when it was passed, one of the leaders of the movement opposing police abuses turned to me and said, "Well, now it's over. We fixed it." And I looked at her and said, no, we'll never fix it. There will always be tension between the need for police intelligence operations and their abuses. That will never go away.
I'm reminded when he said that, Bill, of what you've taught us from the very beginning. It's not necessary to hope to persevere. And, I find myself so inspired to be in this dialogue with you too, because, let's hit the rewind button for a moment, because I don't know if we've established in this dialogue, although anybody who's ever seen David K. Johnston understand he's probably one of the most prolific and knowledgeable, detailed experts in all things Donald Trump, going back, I think, we're 37 years, right? Your first book was somewhere in the 19...
Almost 36.
36 years, right? And, so the Donald Trump story is not new, but at the same time, it has these sort of, and I've heard you reference this many times, that Donald comes from a white collar fraud family. Mr. Johnston, you had mentioned his grandfather was actually, I think you used the word pimp in the Great Northwest after they came over from
Alaska.
Alaska.
Yeah, in Washington State and Alaska. Yep. Talking
about cyanide, Philinide, for all of the guys searching for gold in the Yukon. But I want to toss this to you first, Bill, though, because look, a lot of this stuff has its sort of growth at that time period where we've spent so much time trying to understand in the SNL debacle as it relates to Michael Milken in the junk bond era as it related to also Trump's Taj Mahal. Can you give us kind of an introduction to that time period and what you guys were discovering in your work? And David, if you could maybe follow up with some of your introspection about some of those details.
Yeah, so these stories overlap as well. And indeed, they overlap in casinos and they overlap with Teamsters funds, and is when it's all starting. Again, this is, as David Kay says, not the start. It's just the start of when I became involved. These things have, the most ancient texts we have, and David teaches this, have codes about fraud. The religious literature is filled with, you shall have honest weights and measures. Jesus cleanses the temple because it has become a den of thieves where they're short weighting people in the sales, etc. And as David has just explained, one of the most important things we try to get across to people is there can never be a decisive victory in the military sense, and where you don't have to fight again. Every generation has to engage in the struggle, and when they don't successfully, more successfully, things don't just stay kind of bad, they can get horrific. And let's take it right out of this week's stuff. We have this insanity of Kevin O'Leary emerging as the great defender of Donald Trump. And Kevin O'Leary is defending him on the basis of, well, we all commit these frauds in real estate. So that's quite a defense. And that has a name. And that comes from, a Nobel Prize winner, as you say, George Akerlof, dubbed it the Gresham's dynamic. And the idea of the Gresham's dynamic is, if you gain a competitive advantage by cheating, then bad ethics will drive good ethics out of the markets. Markets will be criminological because you can't survive if you're honest, if the cheaters are getting an advantage. So O'Leary who is no great brains, defense is, don't you get it? It's a Gresham's dynamic. We're all crooks. And therefore, you shouldn't do anything. You shouldn't stop the crooks. And I will remind you that this is the guy who was bought and paid for by, you know, he didn't sell himself cheap. He got 15 million bucks from Sam Bankman-Fried to shill for Sam Bankman-Fried's frauds as well. And this guy has no excuse at all. He's Canadian. He calls himself Mr. Wonderful. Anyway, there are always such people, because if you don't regulate effectively, as David Kay explained, then eventually in particular industries, not everywhere in the markets, in particular industries most susceptible, and hint, anything that deals with finance, anything that has huge cash flow, like casinos, these are going to be areas that people are going to use as fraud centers, and they're going to learn these tactics. And then what they're going to do is create what we call in the criminology biz, predatory networks. They're going to use the funds of the firm, which are vast compared to other purposes. So, for example, in our entire history of the United States of America, it has always been chump change from the perspective of the elite fraudster to be able to make political contributions or outright bribes to prominent politicians, to, as David Kay said, make sure that you get appointed the people that make the laws. We had Charles Keating, as you mentioned, was able to get a majority of the House of Representatives to co-sponsor a resolution calling on us to stop re-regulating the industry. And that majority of the House of Representatives included the entire leadership. So that's Speaker, Majority Leader, Whip, and you know, on the other side, the Majority Leader, Whip, from both political parties to co-sponsor that resolution. 5 U.S. senators, as you heard. The President of the United States attempted to appoint a majority of my federal agency appointees selected by Charles Keating, the most notorious fraud. The top audit firms in the world engaged in assisting this. Charles Keating had over 100 law firms on retainer. They had corrupt appraisers. They had corrupt loan brokers. These predatory networks are force multipliers that can massively increase things. And they understand point vulnerabilities. So I can ruin an entire regulatory agency by, in our case, having an enforcement director who didn't believe in enforcement, having a head of an agency who would block everything that you needed to be done in many circumstances. So I'll stop talking at that point. But these are examples of what I've found, which I think are very broadly consistent with certainly the stuff I've read from David Kay.
David, obviously, let's picking up there. I mean, it's interesting that he brought, we call it the fish rots from the head, right? So, you know, we might want to turn this back to Donald just for a moment, because, I mean, I don't know a better metaphor than to say we can't see the forest for the trees, David, but yet you've been bringing these truths forever and it's around us 24/7, but yet there's this convoluted message. When you appoint through the lowest ROI investment in a corrupt politician, I've also heard you talk about Citizens United. I mean, we're just talking about this force multiplier. What era are we living in 2024, given what Bill just mapped out?
Well, we're living in an era right now that I think is about to undergo a radical change for the better, because I don't think that most Americans want to live in a dictatorship, want to give up their freedoms. And we've seen this with the votes that followed Hobbes, in which everywhere it's on the ballot, women's reproductive rights win overwhelmingly, and they win strongly among Republican women. But Bill's fundamental point, and this goes to Donald's getting where he got, is that you have to have systems to control and regulate. One of the first things during the 8 years I taught my third-year law students and graduate business students the law of the ancient world, what I was trying to do is explain to them and give them a foundation of why the law is the way it is today. Law grows from human experience. Leonardo da Vinci figured out how to build aircraft, but nobody thought about aviation law until we actually had airplanes. We are on the cusp of the genetic age, and the grandchildren of my students will almost certainly be able to go down to a store that I'll call Designer Genes, capital D, capital G, and describe the kind of child they want to create instead of what nature randomly produces. And there'll have to be a whole bunch of law about genetic administration and manipulation by human beings, not just of fellow human beings, but animals. We're trying right now to bring back the woolly mammoth, or a version of it, and Jurassic Park may and someday not be fiction. So regulatory systems matter, and everything is regulated. I tell my students examples of things that are regulated they haven't thought about. Driving a car, getting a license, the rules of your bank account. And then I say to them, and this university, like every college and university in America, regulates dating. They all go sort of glassy-eyed. What? And I said, yes, it regulates dating. Think about it. Come on, somebody come up with an answer. It's almost always one of the women. And they eventually go, do you mean sexual harassment? And I go, well, someone may call it, I'd like you to go out on a date. And you may call it sexual harassment. But yes, we regulate dating. And that is a fundamental principle that we have to understand. There is no such thing as deregulation. There is only new regulation. And when the changes that started to occur under Carter and took off like a rocket, starting with Reagan, the re-regulation was against the interests of consumers, against the interests of honest people, against the interest of protecting little guys who are ill-informed, and protecting and shielding predators. And that is just simply not widely understood. The number of journalists who understand these issues, I don't know, Bill, what are there, maybe 5 or 6 of us in the country, some tiny insignificant number. So when you pick up the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and you read an account about a regulatory matter, my reading of these is that they're accurately reciting what their sources are telling the journalist, but the journalist almost always has no understanding of the foundational principles that are involved in regulation. And it's often cast as a political battle rather than an effort at ensuring integrity, minimizing litigation, and being fair to people who are less informed. And so Donald is masterful at exploiting these things. When he wanted to tear down the Bonwit Teller department store on Fifth Avenue to build Trump Tower, he got control of it. It wasn't doing well as a business. And with help from MetLife, arranged to take it down. He was supposed to preserve this beautiful, I would call it a brooch on a building rather than on a blouse in the front of the building. Didn't do that. He was supposed to preserve the 2 Art Deco bas-relief dancers who seemed, even though they were in stone, to be dancing. And he just had them dropped to the pavement and smashed because he's a Philistine. He beat 4 grand juries in his 30s. He ran out the clock on 2. He ratted out other people, and I don't remember at the moment the 4th one what happened, but 4 grand juries. The regulatory system failed. In fact, the best example of how it failed, and this goes right to Bill's work, New York law requires that all mortgages issued by New York banks, wherever they're issued, you get a bank on, I just paid off a mortgage on a house I own in New Jersey from a New York bank. that mortgage by law must be recorded at the courthouse where the property is located. That's to both protect the banking system and protect the bank's interest in the mortgage and to protect the homeowner. Well, I have in my files behind me a letter from Chase Bank in 1985 promising Donald Trump that they will never record at the courthouse or make a public record of the loan he took out to buy Mar-a-Lago in 1985. Trump went around saying, I paid cash for Mar-a-Lago. Well, in a sense he did. He paid Chase Bank's cash. He paid he got a loan for 125% of the value of the property and put that extra money, $2 million, in his pocket, which is something he did all the time. He took out a loan for more than a property was worth and cut a fee for himself. And now correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I don't think there's anything illegal about that so long as you record the mortgage. A bank can loan you more than the purchase price because you can say, well, it's for furniture or improvements to the property.
Yeah, there were some time periods and some types of loans where it would have been a violation of regulation, and the lying about the violation of the regulation would have been a felony. But yes, you're generally right.
Yeah. So thank you. So Donald got where he got through things like he hired illegal immigrants to tear down Bonwit Teller by hand. And these guys who came from Poland in the middle of winter were living in this building that they're tearing down by hand with sledgehammers. They were stripping wires to get the copper so it could be sold, stripping the plastic covering off them by hand. Some of them turned out to be hot wires. He then refused to pay these guys. They're illegals. What are they going to do? So they got paid because they took his overseer to the 9th floor, leaned him over the edge, and said, you can go over the edge or we get paid. He went running across to Donald's office across the street. Donald, by the way, claimed to not know anything was going on, even though he had a picture window view of what was going on, and said, you got to pay these guys that are going to kill me. When he returned with cash to pay these guys, they went to a table, they signed a little thing saying they'd been paid, and then at the end of the table was a mob guy who got $50 from each person as they got paid. No law enforcement. By the way, everything I've described about taking the building down violates building codes and safety codes. Neither I nor the late great Wayne Barrett was ever able to find any record of any building or safety inspector ever blowing the whistle or issuing a citation about this building. After all, you're dealing with people who might put you off the end of the building and mob guys. So regulatory systems to work have to have enough staff. They have to be written to be enforceable and effective with little to no loopholes in them. And they have to have public support. And we're now living in a society, to go back to your original question, where a lot of people don't even believe in democracy anymore. I mean, it is really easy to find people who democracy is meaningless to them. They want King Donald, who calls himself Savior, who sells brand name Bibles, which to any actual Christian is, of course, a blasphemy, and who doesn't even hide what I said about him, wrote about him 9 years ago, that he wants to be our dictator. He just says, oh, just for one day. But he wants to be our dictator, and if he gets in office, he will be our dictator unless there's a revolt by our military officers. And just a little digression about regulation on this point. If you're a grunt or a sailor, you take an oath to follow the orders of the President of the United States and uphold our Constitution. If you are a military officer, you take an oath to the Constitution, not to follow the orders of the President. That is just a bedrock principle of civilian control. Donald doesn't understand that. Large numbers of Americans don't understand that. I've actually been on radio shows where people say, you're a liar. And I say, just go to the internet and look up the oath, and you'll see that what I'm telling you is correct. So how we design regulatory systems matters a lot, and whether there's the money to enforce them. And to think that more than 1 or 2% of the population is going to understand or care about these things is a folly.
Well, I'm one of those 1 or 2% of the people who absolutely my entire life revolves on trying to solve these riddles. And one of my go-tos that I created from learning from Bill, but just this entire panoply of this systemic corruption that we're surrounded by. I say corruption burns and fuels fascism, and that's what we're in the midst of. But I want to segue back to you, Bill, particularly for my original question. But I want to use the title again of David's book, written in 1992, Temples of Chance: How America Incorporated Bought Out Murder Incorporated. Anybody who's ever seen a Martin Scorsese film or understood the mafia's role in gambling back in the 50s understands what a prolific title this is. And the second part of the sequence is To Win Control of the Casino Business, which brings me back to the notion of the junk bonds and Michael Milken and Taj Mahal and Donald Trump. Can you talk about kind of some of the sequencing and what were the methodology involved that you guys had discovered?
Okay, so let's pick up on where David was taking us as well. So he's illustrated two key things that white collar criminologists try to get across, right? One is the key to success as one of these criminals is not genius, it's audacity. And that is Trump, period. The second thing is these people reveal the weaknesses in the system and the weaknesses in people, right? So David is concentrated on the weaknesses of people who, they resent the world. They want Trump doesn't just say, I'll be your dictator. He says, I'll be your retribution. And that's really what they want. They want someone unrestrained by law, unrestrained by ethics, who will simply crush the people they hate. And they will revel in that while calling themselves Christians, right? So one of my famous things was Trump was giving his talk, I think it was at Liberty University, and he did his 2 Corinthians thing. That's it. That's the whole thing. And 2 co-eds are shown, and they turn and look at each other, and they get the biggest laughs on their faces, and then they turn around and applaud. So they know absolutely the man is a liar. He's been interviewed, by very, very Christian types about, so what are, some of your favorite verses that you draw inspiration? And he obviously cannot come with a single line from the Bible. And it is completely obvious that he is the opposite, right? That if you believe the Bible, he would be the Antichrist, right? He just plain fits the definition of how the Antichrist will operate and in all of these things. Okay, so Donald Trump is not sophisticated. That doesn't mean he's ineffective, right? And I think both of us are trying to get that part across. You don't have to be sophisticated. The folks in the savings and loan debacle, the folks that ended up taking over the casinos, they were much more sophisticated than the traditional mob. So even in the mob literature, you always hear, right, in Scorsese and such, of they want to go legit. They want to go legit. They don't mean legit, right? They mean that they want, so if The Godfather has, right in the initial scenes, it has illustrations of what they mean by legit. First, The Godfather is reading the telegrams, or having the telegrams read to him, of the senators and members of Congress who are saying, hey, you understand why I'm not attending your daughter's wedding. And the FBI is out in the parking lot writing down the license numbers. That's what you want to get out of. You want the senators and the House of Representatives, the members of the House, to glory in being seen with you. You want the FBI working for you, and the Secret Service in particular for Donald Trump, working for you to spread lies and such. You want to politicize the Secret Service, take one of their leaders and make him a White House guy as opposed to a Secret Service guy, right? That's what they mean by legit. But then they wanted to use all kinds of intimidation, strikes, captive unions, and such. They weren't going to go legit in the moral sense. They wanted to be seemingly legitimate. That's the key. That's our phrase in criminology, seemingly legitimate. And Trump shows how barely seemingly you need. It doesn't take much at all. And indeed, people kind of like that you're clearly someone who was who took his life lessons not only from his dad and granddad thieves, but from Roy Cohn, who was also not particularly sophisticated, right? This was not a great lawyer. This guy was a complete asshole. But he was an asshole. Think of this guy that could be at the top ranks of what was then the Republican Party. And then after scandal after scandal, including personal scandal in an era when being a homosexual, was a really bad thing, and becomes the Democratic fixer in the citadel of the Democrats, New York City and New York State. That's who Trump learns from. And what he learns is picked up with, again, he doesn't hire a top tier audit firm the way the real sophisticates do. He has a second tier firm. In fact, a notorious internationally second tier firm for assisting money laundering and such. He doesn't have top lawyers. The guy who's going to testify against him, he's a graduate of what was voted the worst law school in America. And they put him, that law school put him in their pantheon because he was working for Trump, not the other way around, right? So these folks Charles Keating always selected people who had barely graduated from much less impressive programs and had a big chip on their shoulder. And then what did he do? He called them geniuses. And so people understand how to manipulate. And that's what Roy Cohn is all about. You manipulate, you intimidate, you hire them if they get in the way, right? That's what Keating, but even more Michael Milken. So you want the sophisticate. Michael Milken was, quote unquote, investigated by deans of business schools who, Bill Seidman, who was a dean of a business school and head of a second tier accounting firm, Seidman Company, wrote that he assigned a bunch of business school profs to investigate how Drexel was able to do this stuff. And they came back and said, genius. Akerlof and Romer, both Nobel Prize laureates in looting the economic underworld of bankruptcy for profit, go through it and say, no, he had this network of corrupted firms, including Lincoln Savings. There were 11 savings and loans plus Executive Life, a very large insurance company. Lincoln Savings, that got the guy, Charles Keating, acquired it without a penny of his own money. He massively overpaid for it because he wanted it quick. He got all the money from Drexel, Michael Milken's junk bond firm, and he needed 55 because, again, that was overpaying greatly, but they gave him 125. And that was characteristic because then they have you by the short hairs, right? You are so deeply in debt. And what was the deal? Lincoln Savings, and of course this deal is not in writing, had to give $1 billion to Drexel which it stayed purportedly at Lincoln, but all control over it was wielded by Drexel Burnham Lambert. Now, of course, they use this and the other captives to make sure deals make, right? So when you give your underwriting as an investment banker, in the case of Drexel, famously, this confidence, we're highly confident that we can do the financing. They would always make, because you could use your captives. Even if it's a really crappy deal and no one else would buy it, you could use the captives to make sure that the deal made as an investment banker.
And Bill, if I can just break in for a second, the reason the captives went along is that if you didn't go along, even on the occasional really crappy deal for them, you were out of all future deals. So this is the one of the core levers.
You were out of all future deals, but also you were $125 million in debt and you couldn't pay it. Right. He had you by the short hairs deliberately by the way he structured. You're right. There was a whole series of these things. Anyway, all the deals would make, and when the deals went bad, they could be restructured. So troubled debt restructuring is this massive thing. We don't have time probably to go through the details, but in real estate, this is God, savior. And it's used all the time. And it was used by Milken all the time to avoid defaults. Because if they agreed to a TDR, it's not a default, right? As they was counted in those numbers. So to do this, they just ran into one little bitty problem. Junk bonds are a commercial loan in economic substance. And David mentioned the point that there's this thing called regulation. And in those days, the regulations required that you underwrite before you make the loan. And of course, they had done, because Lincoln Savings had nothing to do with $1 billion, but it was churned. So it was really more like $3 billion, churned to maximize fees. They had zero underwriting documents on $3 billion in transactions. And so they went to Arthur Andersen, that at that time, the most prestigious audit firm in the world, and the one that was known as Moral. And they were already the auditor, and said, hey, create underwriting documents that are undated and only have information up to the date of the purchase of the junk bonds, so they'll look contemporaneous, and stuff tens of thousands of pages of documents into the loan files our examiners would review. Now that's a sophisticated fraud by the top level folks. And here's the kicker. David's point. Yes, a big thing was Ed Gray and his decision to take on the frauds, but what they did is transform the agency to create the capacity, both in the examiner ranks and then in a criminal referral system that we developed over years of what business school would now call continuous improvement, getting feedback from the Justice Department and improving it and training our people to get better and better and better. And that system brought in people like Bart DeZevi, who was a lawyer by background who became an examiner. And this is the most boring thing in the world, reading these underwriting files, is just, just staggeringly put yourself to sleep. David Kay and I have both, I'm sure, found ourselves with our chin on the table at 3 a.m. and realized we'd fallen asleep reading these damn things. Bart DeZevi not only stays in the game reading thousands of these pages, but realizes there are pagination inconsistencies. And he starts pulling the loose thread. And I'm sure David has 1,000 stories like this. And that's what exposed eventually this massive fraud scheme. Now,
Patrick, I think Bill is being much too modest here. Bill was a grade regulator, a lawyer in an obscure regulatory agency. We have like 5 big financial regulatory agencies. He figures out fundamentally what's going on here, and more importantly, figures out how to explain it to his bosses. That's the only reason that we had the Keating Five and the savings and loan scandal. And one of the Keating Five, Senator Don Regal from Michigan, later accused Bill of secretly tape recording a meeting he was in with the 5 senators because Bill took such great notes that he could virtually reconstruct the conversation. You know, in a more decent America, Remy Welling, the IRS agent who put me onto, and I broke the story of the backdated stock options in Silicon Valley, for which, curiously, the Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize, not me. Bill and a handful of other people would have statues erected to them as heroes of economic liberty and sensibility. But of course, nobody's going to put up statues. And both Bill and I, after we die, there are people who will hold parties and say, thank God that son of a bitch is gone.
Not if I have anything to do about it, because I'll tell you, you know, this is just look, there's so much more to that story, but yet it sets the columns, right? And we don't have much time left, but I got to kind of set you up for this, David, in so much that Bill taught us, you know, it's interesting, the nuances of the dialectic here, that you're saying it's re-regulation. Bill has always taught us that it's deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization.
Yeah.
In the context, and I'm not saying there's a point of contention here, because you're both saying the same thing, but ultimately what we learned through Bill on this mammoth, you know, odyssey to get all of the answers of the great financial crisis, what I want to, because millions of people know who you are, but unfortunately tens of millions really need to understand everything that you're telling us about Donald Trump now, that spans what he really is, which you've always said, he's just a con. I mean, yeah, I mean, to be so, you know, pedantic is to call it Don the Con, but he's been lying, stealing, and deceiving his entire career. But if the system doesn't enable these like little pockets for people like Donald to maneuver in the grand scheme of things, compared to Michael Milken back in the day, or the other sophisticants that Bill has taught us, are the CEOs, and the fish rots from the head, and we understand Gresham's dynamic, and we understand control fraud. And what you understand is that the deregulation from the Clinton era forward, you know, after they got it right during the S&L crisis, after you got it right during the S&L crisis, the key consideration that I hope that you can combine is the key takeaways that we need to understand as a population about everything that you've learned from Donald Trump in as short of a time period as you can, but within the context of this deregulation, that we know we have the tools, we have the answers, we have the capacity to basically lay bare these guys, right? Both in media as well as in the courts, to where there's no way in hell, if we had a democracy and people were informed, and if they actually cared about liberty and the law and order and integrity of the law, that none of this would be even a remote possibility. I could obviously carry on for hours in this direction, but go ahead.
Well, Bill made the very important point about audacity.
Yeah,
is a key element in these things. You know, human beings are herd animals. We follow a leader. Now, you can like or hate Ronald Reagan, but I don't think anybody can dispute that he's a leader. He led us away from the New Deal into the era we're in now of everybody's out for themselves. And to many people, hopefully a minority of Americans, Donald Trump is a leader because he's completely audacious. He doesn't care about the rules. Surprisingly, there was some research done after the famous Billy Bush grab him by the privates tape that showed significant number of women were drawn to him and wanted to support him after that, which, you know, but that's the reality of the society that we live in. So government is just like corporations in a very important sense. I teach my students corporations are simply empty vessels. They're pieces of paper that describe what they can do. It is human beings who decide what they do. Well, the same thing is true of government. Our Constitution and our laws, they're just pieces of paper. So it matters who the people are who are in charge of these institutions. It matters that there are checks and balances and limits upon their power. And it matters that they feel a sense of responsibility to the society around them and to the future. When Joe Biden, for example, is Catholic, but he's made it very clear he will not sign any law that bans all abortions. And it's very clear that what the Trump wing of the Republicans want to do is ban birth control. I mean, literally, a woman at Heritage, who was part of this Project 25, said that we need to return consequentiality to sex and get rid of birth control. Don't imagine that would be very popular, but I also know you can sell that. You just wrap it up in complicated words like consequentiality that most people don't know what they mean, and other things to get what you want to do. So respect for the principles is very, very central to all the issues that are going on here. So when you have people in office who have no regard for anyone else, and that's Donald. Donald has no regard for anyone. You and I and even his daughter Ivanka, we are objects. We are not equals to him. And everything he does is transactional. And he is not at all sophisticated, absolutely not sophisticated. And he gets away with telling the most audacious lies. I mean, I am known around the world for my knowledge of tax policy. I've lectured all over the world about it, written books about it, best-selling books. Donald says, I'm the greatest expert in the history of the world on taxes. And then he testifies under oath. Well, what do you know about accounting, sir? I don't know anything about accounting. You don't know anything about accounting? And the lawyers tie him down like 8 ways that he doesn't know anything about accounting. You cannot understand tax if you don't know accounting. I had to go learn accounting, just like Bill, after he uncovered these evil schemes going on in the SNL area, went and got a degree in criminology and developed a whole new theory called control fraud. When I went to college, you were taught that, well, the executives of the company, the principals, might see to it they get a nicer office and perks and things that make life comfortable for them. Their focus is on running the company for the welfare of the people who own it. And Bill showed no.
This is our country too, is it not? Sorry.
Yeah, you can. Bill showed in his research very simply that no, you get control of the company, and you loot it, and it's not unlike a mob bust out. They get into the hooks of some guy who's in gambling debts, take over his business, order all sorts of liquor and meat on the guy's behalf, and then torch the joint after they steal it all. And these are matters that only work if people pay attention. Now, ordinary Americans don't have the time to spend on these things. That's Adam Smith's lesson about specialization. So we have specialists who do these things who are professionals, like when Bill was a government regulator. And we have news organizations. And when I started out, I was a 19-year-old staff writer on the front page of the San Jose Mercury. One of the things I was very struck by was how city councilmen and school board members and state legislators, they were sort of nervous around me, and they were very careful about what was going on. And if I broke some story that, caused problems for them, they were quick to act. Now, they don't care. By and large, it's got to be really bad scandal before the politicians care. It's journalists who do a lot of the work of holding people accountable. And Trump, of course, smartly has gone after my class as the enemy of the people. So we want to preserve our democracy. People have to be citizens. They have to think. They have to recognize that we have to have specialists in every area, from regulating banking to writing about what Congress did yesterday. And Donald, he didn't care about any of that. He just wants the power, and he wants the ego gratification because all his life growing up, his father told him what a useless piece of crap he was.
Well, the consequences are exponential with this election, but yet the lessons that you guys have both laid down are what this country needs to wrap its head around. Final question, maybe as a setup to another question, if you're willing to go slightly longer, but I'll leave it up to you guys. But you know, Bill, again, I ask you first, and then let's ask David. What would have happened if we took out Trump 3 decades ago? If Trump actually went to prison, had his companies disbanded, then what would we be looking at now?
Well, you wouldn't have this enormous threat that David has just been talking about. It's not that Trump has created a Gresham's dynamic. As a fraudster, he's always been sort of class C minus at best, maybe D plus type of thing. But he chose to go into politics, right? And that is what has transformed him into one of the greatest threats to the world. And to, as David said, anyone that believes that there should be a rule of law. When they talk about that plan, David alluded to the Heritage Plan for taking over the government. That is explicitly to get rid of anybody like me that might remain, that would enforce the law. That is exactly that's what their lesson was. Think of how many Trump appointees have testified against Trump. Right?
Yeah.
Think go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bill.
And how many have been disbarred, around him and such. They don't want to get into a situation where those people are going to ever exist or ever be in danger of being flipped. And that's what the Heritage Plan is all about.
Yeah. The Bill's exactly right about that. The fundamental challenge here is to get enough people in the 6 states that sort of will decide this, or take a broader view, the 13 states that could go either way. Get the majority of people to the polls just to preserve our democracy. That's what this election is about. Are we going to throw away the world's oldest democracy to honor one man who doesn't deserve any honors at all? And your underlying question, what if Trump had been pursued a long time ago? He might have come back. You can't dismiss that possibility, but I don't think if he were a convicted felon, he would be where he is now in terms of his political position. I'm not big on polls, particularly in the current era, because less than 1% of people, fewer than 1% of people who answer the phone will answer the questions. And no matter how big your sample is, I don't think that you get a representative sample when you have that small of a response. And some pollsters have told me the same thing, that they're very troubled about the low response rates. But the surveys do show that if Trump is convicted of any felony, a lot of his support among independents goes away. And among Republicans who are kind of on the line, Trump or no Trump, it goes away. And so this effort to avoid a trial, happening all of these much too late because law enforcement was slow, as it often is. But these efforts to avoid a trial are critical to this. And our Supreme Court is behaving awfully in this matter. I mean, they wanted to solve this issue. They could have solved it in a minute by simply not taking up, does Donald Trump have complete immunity for actions in office, which of course he doesn't, or we're not living under a rule of law. We're back under King George. And in fact, we're worse than under King George because he did have to answer to Parliament. So what matters in this election isn't Donald Trump. We know who he is. It is getting enough people of goodwill who want to maintain the liberties of the people to vote, not stay home, but vote. That means getting them registered in those 13 states and then getting them to the polls. Unfortunately, the Democrats, who you would think would be the party that's organized to deal with working people, don't seem to have the skill at doing that, and they certainly are no good at messaging. Whereas the Republicans have these big ideological marketing organizations, Cato, Heritage, et cetera, that come up with slogans, the death tax, things like that. And the Democrats, have a long history of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And I've talked to a lot of top Democrats about this face to face, and they don't like hearing that. They don't want to hear it. That's one of the ways that they're not like business people. I've been a consultant to a number of business people, and when I say, here's what's screwed up in your business that nobody's telling you, they pay attention and then they do things. They may not do exactly what I thought they ought to do, but they realize, oh, okay, well, I know there's a problem now. I have another understanding of it, and they act. Democrats, sort of want to be who they are. They are change averse and risk averse, as most human beings are. But I think we will get through this. If we do, then the challenge becomes that we've got to do a much better job of educating our citizenry. Everybody who teaches, I'll be shocked if Bill disagrees with me about what I'm about to say, is the depth of knowledge that students bring from their high school education to the university is significantly weakened in this century, and certainly in the last 5 or so years. Their ability to write, their ability to make a cogent argument, their ability to analyze has declined. And I've talked with people all across the country, and I'm not a career person. I mean, I'm on a faculty, but that's not my career. It's a sidelight. But I've talked to lots of people about this, and I hear it universally from people from Lawrence Tribe, our greatest constitutional scholar, to folks who teach in junior colleges in Iowa. We really need to improve our education system and to stop turning out drones to work in factories and turn out people with critical thinking skills. I've had better conversations about economics, culture, politics, geopolitics with a random cop on the roadside in Slovakia, a waitress in Austria in a restaurant, a fellow who sat down next to me on a sofa in a hotel in Singapore, than Americans with MBAs or even legal degrees sitting next to me in first class on a cross-country flight. It's very troubling how.
Wow.
And we live in a country where Fox did very good polling for many, many years because Roger Ailes understood polling, that showed that, they had the best measure of sexism. 24% of Americans believed in warlocks, but 28% believed in witches. But the fact that 1 in 4 Americans believes in either one tells you a lot about how nutty our society is.
Yeah, we lived in Silicon Valley for 20 years area, and a significant number of the people there do not allow their children to use the devices, for example, because they know how mind-numbingly destructive it is.
Well, we barely scratched the surface of what I wanted to do. I propose, I would love to try to get you guys on an ongoing series together just to continue talking about this. So maybe I'll reach out. But I do have to ask one last question, and it's because it's so critical, David. Look, I think you're best known from where I'm sitting for having appeared on Rachel Maddow revealing Donald Trump's taxes several years ago, and I've had conversations with Suzanne Craig of the New York Times, as well as David Enrich, and I understand the whole, relationship between Deutsche Bank and Trump, and as it fits into what I've learned from Bill regarding control fraud and so forth. And there's so much more to tell. But by way of the media, something triggered me just recently, and it's really hard for me to digest this, given all that we saw this last week, particularly, and I put so much of my emphasis and learning and knowledge from the guys that you've mentioned, like Lawrence Tribe, like Andrew Weissman, Neil Katyal, some of these guys that are guests on MSNBC specifically that are experts, and a lot of the details of what we're seeing unfold in these indictments with Trump and so forth. But last week, the big controversy was Ronna McDaniel being hired by NBC, and then both Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell made an incredibly eloquent and a powerful positioning about what the lessons were from Watergate, that you don't hire somebody close to the crime, right? But meanwhile, and I don't want to create a huge conversation, but I just got to get a soundbite here, or whatever you're willing to talk about. Meanwhile, 2 weeks ago, former Attorney General under the Obama administration, Eric Holder, made a proclamation that it's up to we the people to actually save our democracy because our institutions cannot save us, right? Meanwhile, because of our work, we know all things that the Department of Justice didn't circle the noose around Wall Street, given the 2008 great financial crisis, given all of the details of information that we have. Can you please make sense to me how, if we're going to put all of our trust, and we know how much is on the line for this election cycle, given the insanity of Donald Trump? It's just insane. This guy is such a loon, such a fraud, just a two-bit worst proclamation I could possibly imagine after having listened to all of your, look, I could go on and on and on. Tell me, how do you yourself, when you consider tens of millions of people got destroyed, tens of trillions of dollars got backdoored to Wall Street for many of the same things we see on display by way of course, the fraud indictment and the $450 million just reduced to 100, yada, yada, yada. Please give me some clarity about how we can have moral positioning when we're not willing to deal with the actual failure of those institutions.
The whole point of the American Revolution and our overthrowing the first American government so that we could live under the Constitution, the Second American Republic, is that we determine our fate. We decide. We can decide to throw our democracy away and elect Donald Trump. That's the point. No one is going to save us. Donald Trump certainly isn't going to save us. We're going to decide. And in the case of things like the economic collapse in 2007 and 8, it is astonishing that nobody went to jail. That collapse was 175 times bigger in economic terms than the S&L scandal that Bill exposed back around 1990. Yet there were virtually no prosecutions at all. The people who ran the corrupt institutions, some of them are still there 16 years later. The Obama administration made a policy decision. They weren't going to prosecute these people. It's as if you left the embezzlers in charge of the bank. And they lied and denied about it, which I wrote about a great deal back then. It matters that we have integrity in our institutions. And if we have Donald Trump, there will be literally no integrity whatsoever. Integrity, in fact, will be anathema to a second Trump administration. That doesn't mean a second Biden administration will be perfect. It won't. But we need to start building a society where integrity is at the core of it, or we're going to end up in the long run a society of oligarchs and serfs.
Bill, last word, please.
Yeah, if you enable Trump, he will and his minions will come after all kinds of folks. It's a bit like first they came from the Jews and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't do anything, et cetera, type of thing. These people believe it's great that Trump is going to go after people. But they have children, friends, and such who will be Jewish, will be gay, will be, believers in freedom and such, and they will eventually pay the price as well. Fascism gets intensely worse, right? And these folks, if they actually, David is quite right. The polls show that a significant number of Americans are intrigued by the idea of a strong man and getting rid of democracy. Be careful what you wish for. You may receive it.
Well, on that note, that's we're about 10 minutes over, guys. I'm so grateful for both of your time. I'm going to be working to try to make this into a television series, but I will, just leave it open-ended that I will be in touch with you both to hopefully maybe get us both to continue and maybe a little bit more focused on the next round if we can. But guys, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the American people. And on that note, I'm going to hit stop record. All the best to you both.
Take care.
Thank you much.